On the morning of February 2, 1685, the peaceful corridors of Whitehall Palace were pierced suddenly by a noise so ghastly, it would haunt the minds of those who heard it for decades. King Charles II, history's merry monarch, emitted what contemporary witnesses said was the most ghastly scream before succumbing to atrocious convulsions. Only 4 days after that, on February 6 at exactly 11:45 a.m., the 54-year-old monarch breathed his last. His body had been consumed by a mysterious disease, an ailment so inexplicable that it would generate centuries of speculation, gossip, and fascination of the macabre kind. When royal doctors finally opened his body, what they discovered inside would shake the foundations of modern medical knowledge. The findings were so horrific that rumors of poison, black alchemy, and even magical curses spread like a wildfire through the kingdom. But the true explanation, uncovered in the king's autopsy, was possibly more frightening than any gossiped conspiracy. Charles II had ruled England for 25 years, leading the country out of its puritanic past and into an age of indulgence, scientific inquiry, and decadent luxury. But behind the facade of that golden era, his body was silently rotting. His last years were spent in slow, concealed disintegration from within, one so advanced it's a wonder he lived as long as he did. The postmortem, conducted by Sir Charles Scarborough, was more in the style of a blood-curdling horror novel than of a medical report. Each of the main organs showed evidence of utter devastation, portraying a picture of prolonged suffering that the king had silently borne behind the facade of regal restraint. Today's doctors examining ancient reports now think Charles probably died from chronic kidney disease that resulted in uremia, a poisonous blood buildup that infects the entire body. But the entire picture of what was discovered reveals far more sinister and complicated events. Let's take a moment to think about the times. The late 17th century was a dark age for medicine. Physicians used methods which tended to do more harm than good: bloodletting, blistering, and bizarre elixirs. In Charles's case, these treatments turned into torture. And yet, even as death closed in, the king held himself together, even joking with his courtiers, asking their pardon for being such an unconscionable time at dying. But don't be mistaken, the conditions of his demise were not normal. Some thought he was assassinated by poisoning. Others thought shadowy supernatural powers were involved. And many attributed it to the king's own experiments, cavalier alchemical endeavors entailing the use of lethal materials such as mercury. In fact, Charles had long possessed a private laboratory in which he experimented with chemicals, frequently without protective gear. Mercury, later proved to be highly damaging to the kidneys, was used on a frequent basis by the king. Servants remembered later seeing unusual burns on his arms and hands, damage which he brushed off nonchalantly as minor accidents. In reality, these poisonous experiments were silently eroding his organs, day by day. Mercury poisoning does not kill rapidly. It is a stealthy killer, slowly wearing down the kidneys and slowly poisoning the system. And the symptoms Charles had fit the condition to the T. He had awful headaches, confusion, shortness of breath, and the unmistakable signs of renal failure. Courtiers saw disturbing changes. His skin, once a radiant complexion, now became gray and pale, eyes sunken and bloodshot. He forgot his trains of thought mid-sentence. His hands shook, and he kept them folded behind his back to conceal the trembling. Even his fabled libido, a hallmark of his courtly image, waned, adding to rumors of curses and dark magic. Behind closed doors, matters were even more dire. Charles suffered cycles of excruciating stomach pain, screaming in torment during the early hours of the night. The attacks left him bedridden for days, drinking only water and wine as his body cried out for respite. Then, on February 2nd, it had started as any ordinary day at Whitehall. The king went to bed at his normal time, exhausted but calm. He had spared himself a walk in St. James's Park because of aching leg ulcers, opting for a sedate carriage ride instead. Servants noted he was more tired than normal, but wrote it off as his long-standing gout, an affliction aggravated by his lavish, indulgent lifestyle. But at about 7 a.m., a blood-curdling shriek shook the silence of the palace. Guards rushed into the chambers of the king, with the assumption of an assassination. What they discovered was even more chilling, the monarch writhing in agony, utterly at the mercy of some unknown terror. And this was just the start of England's most spooky royal medical enigma. When the royal physicians reached the bedside of Charles II, they were greeted by a ghastly sight. The king was lying flat out, his face deathly pale, lips blue-tinged, and his body still quivering from the after-effects of awful convulsions. His state was one that the physicians had never seen before. Sometimes his body became stiff as a board, then shook uncontrollably, as if some unseen power was endeavoring to tear his very soul from his body. The doctors acted quickly, but by today's standards, their actions were not only unsuccessful, they were savage. Prior to noon, they sucked out 16 ounces of blood from the veins of the king, a virtual pint, hoping it would restore his humors to balance. There came then a deluge of medieval treatments: cupping, scarification, and the use of cantharides, a technique using blister beetles to cause painful welts on the body. All of this was accomplished before the king had even come to consciousness. When Charles did come to, he was frail but conscious, just enough to know his courtiers and physicians. His tongue was slurred, and he grumbled of searing headaches and vomiting. But the doctors took this as a good sign, presuming their torturous treatments were taking effect. They redoubled efforts with even more brutal techniques. The king was administered emetics to cause vomiting, cathartics to cause bowel movements, and repeated enemas. On the second day, his condition appeared to improve slightly. He was able to speak more distinctly and even eat a little. But this respite was mercifully short-lived. What was seeming recovery was probably no more than the final spasms of vitality from a dying body. By February 3rd, once again the convulsions began, this time with even greater ferocity. Charles was left completely exhausted. In reaction, the doctors bled him once more, taking another 8 ounces of blood. They turned to even more rare and risky mixtures, including some containing mercury, antimony, and even pulverized human skull, a ghastly ingredient once thought to possess healing properties. Whitehall Palace was in a state of frenzy and fear. News of the king's state spread quickly. Courtiers stood in the corridors, praying and anxiously wondering who would inherit the throne next. Queen Catherine of Braganza, even though her marriage had been strained by Charles's numerous affairs, stayed by his bedside both day and night. So bad was the king's state that some of his mistresses were even allowed to come in, evidence of how serious the king's state was. In the midst of all this turmoil, Charles II was remarkably his old self. Charmed and witty, he still showed glimpses of humor and consideration for others. Even in pain, he joked, and on his deathbed said to his brother James, "Let not poor Nellie starve," a small, loving gesture to his favorite mistress, Nell Gwynn. And to the assembled courtiers, his final words were contrite: "I am sorry, gentlemen, for being such a time a-dying." When the merry monarch finally died on February 6, 1685, his physicians were left awed and seriously apprehensive. His abrupt collapse, combined with the strange and frightening symptoms, had already set off rumors of poisoning. Suspicion swept through the land. Even some of the king's own medical staff wondered whether foul play had felled their monarch. To quiet the rumors, and maybe to safeguard their own reputations, the court ordered an unprecedented measure: a complete autopsy of the king's corpse. Heading the examination was Sir Charles Scarborough, the king's own doctor and a highly regarded figure in the medical community. But nothing could have prepared him, and the rest of the physicians, for what they were about to learn. The internal injury was grotesque. First, the brain. The blood vessels inside Charles's head were grotesquely engorged, swollen to the point of unrecognizability, a very clear indication of severe high blood pressure, a state poorly understood at the time. The pressure itself would have induced agonizing migraines and possibly caused the king's murderous convulsions. Then came the most terrifying find. The cerebral ventricles, fluid-filled chambers of the brain, were distended with what the doctors called a type of serous matter. The brain tissue around them was waterlogged, a state we now know as cerebral edema. Essentially, the king's brain had been drowning within his skull for weeks, perhaps months, prior to his death. As they went on, the terror just grew. Incising the chest, They discovered the right lung adherent to the chest wall, evidencing chronic inflammation and respiratory difficulty which would have beset Charles for years. This would alone account for his frequent wheezing and breathlessness in the last months. His heart also had secrets to reveal. It was abnormally large and hard, evidence of chronic overuse. This indicated severe cardiovascular illness, with the heart laboring to circulate blood through a progressively damaged circulatory system. But the most appalling revelations were in the abdomen. The liver, spleen, and kidneys were all grotesquely distended, filled with fluid and blood. The kidneys in particular had evidence of irreversible damage, confirming current theories that Charles died of kidney failure and the consequent accumulation of toxins in the blood. There were signs of long-standing infections, old injuries that had never really healed, and ruptured internal abscesses with resulting scar tissue. These weren't the signs of an acute illness, but of a body that had been fighting several chronic diseases for years. Possibly the most appalling detail of all was the general color of the internal organs. Instead of their normal healthy colors, they were grayish and mottled, which implied extensive tissue necrosis, the killing of living tissues. The stench that wafted up from the corpse was so vile, so unnatural, that even practiced doctors were visibly affected. This was not natural decay. It was the smell of a body long consumed from within. And so, the mystery that had tormented the kingdom, what killed King Charles II, would not easily be answered. It uncovered a chilling truth. A king who had spent his latter years gradually being devoured by his own fascination, his excesses, and a medical establishment that just didn't have the faintest idea how to rescue him. But that's not the end of the tale. What followed his death would create even more mystery, paving the way for political upheaval, royal intrigue, and a fight for the very heart of the English monarchy. What really killed King Charles II? For centuries, historians puzzled over the mysterious illness that slowly consumed the English monarch. But modern insights into his autopsy and final years have uncovered a shocking possibility, one that involves alchemy, mercury, and the king's own hands. The damage found internally after Charles's death was chilling in itself. His kidneys were badly damaged, which would have allowed toxins to build up in his blood, causing the confusion, the nausea, and seizures that beset him towards the end. Heart and lung complications only made breathing harder and kept him chronically exhausted. But what follows is when things get a jolting turn. There is evidence to suggest Charles was poisoning himself, unwittingly but regularly, over the course of years. Behind the imposing walls of Whitehall Palace was the royal laboratory, to which few were privy but into which the king took a passionate devotion. This was Charles's own retreat, a haven where he practiced alchemy and incipient chemistry with fanatical fervor. What had started as high-minded curiosity might have unbeknownst become the cause of his gradual death. Historical accounts show that Charles was playing with mercury in the years preceding his death. We now understand that chronic exposure to mercury vapor is catastrophic. It disrupts kidneys irreparably, collapses the nervous system, and induces radical behavioral changes. And chillingly, Charles's symptoms conform to those of chronic mercury poisoning with sinister accuracy. Initially, the symptoms are mild: lethargy, headaches, irritability, ones that were apparently observed by many of his courtiers but could not be accounted for. With time, the poisoning destroys the kidneys, causing the buildup of toxins that can induce convulsions and organ failure. Precisely how the king's sickness went. Within the underventilated lab, Charles spent hours warming mercury and other toxic materials, oblivious to the danger. No masks, no gloves, bare hands and open flames. Fumes rose from the room as he labored, and servants would later testify to seeing odd metallic residues on his workbench, probable condensed mercury compounds. Each trip to that lab left him further exposed to poisons, inching him toward a death sentence he did not yet realize he was receiving. Even Charles's personality appeared to change. Once quick-witted and politically astute, the king grew forgetful, indecisive, and preoccupied. Mercury poisoning has been known to bring about loss of memory, trouble concentrating, and even mood swings, all characteristics his courtiers discreetly remarked upon in private letters. Physically, there was the toll also: a slight shake in his hands, a skin that had gone pale and gray, disintegrating teeth, aggravated to the extreme by the sugar diet of the upper class. All these signs conform to the classic picture of mercury poisoning. The kidney injury was permanent, as his organs lost their function to filter poisons out of his blood. A fatal condition known as uremia took hold, causing nausea and vomiting, confusion, and eventually the uncontrollable convulsions that characterized his dying days. But what makes this tragedy even more devastating is that Charles probably didn't have a clue as to what was going on. During the 17th century, the poisonous qualities of mercury were not well understood. Most early scientists and alchemists shared similar unfortunate ends, without realizing that their so-called findings were poisoning them gradually. Charles thought he was doing science a favor. Unbeknownst to him, he was marching right into a chemical trap. And if the poisoning wasn't enough, the king's medical care reduced an already bad situation into a nightmare. It was 1685, and the royal doctors relied on centuries-old notions based on the theory of bodily humors. Their remedies were brutal, outdated, and sadly confident. It started with bloodletting, the cure-all for nearly every disease of the day. Charles was bled twice on his first day of decline, 16 ounces, then 8 more. For a man with kidney failure and dehydration, this enormous loss of blood merely accelerated his body toward a breakdown. Then came cupping, where hot glass cups were applied on the skin to extract more blood. After that, scarification, where the skin of the king was intentionally cut to release even more fluid. All these savage acts had his body covered in cuts and bruises, risking infection and further breaking his already weak health. And it gets worse. Charles was subjected to blistering, a torturous procedure by which powdered Spanish fly beetles, also called cantharides, were rubbed onto his skin, producing chemical burns hoping that the blisters would pull out disease. In fact, they only made him weaker. Within his body, matters were little improved. The doctors gave him violent emetics to induce vomiting and cathartics to cleanse his bowels, despite the fact that he was vomiting and severely dehydrated. These mixtures frequently contained antimony and mercury. More mercury, naturally. Unknowingly, the physicians were accelerating the same poisoning that was killing their patient. These invasive procedures were rooted in superstition, not science. And worse, they made what would have otherwise been a painful decline and agonizing hastened death. The procedures King Charles II underwent during his last days didn't only fail. Chances are, they hastened his death. Already in kidney failure, the cruel purgatives his doctors ordered threw him into violent diarrhea and crippling cramps. His dehydrated body, in its urgent need for liquids, only grew more dehydrated, its condition getting worse. The so-called medications given to him were closer to instruments of torture than treatments. Saker bitter powder, compound peony water, brain compound, and white hellebore, all useless or worse. Others involved even more gruesome ingredients such as macerated human skull, a grim testament to the superstitions that still controlled 17th century medicine. To current analysis, these remedies, far from restoring the king to health, presumably shortened his life. The massive loss of blood would have continued to debilitate his already failing kidneys. Dehydration had already concentrated his poison-filled blood, and the drugs pumped more toxins into an already strained system. Ironically, the physicians quite possibly beat the disease to the line, unintentionally killing their patient before nature could. But even during all this pain, Charles II himself was amazingly calm. He tolerated all the procedures with dignity and, unbelievably, even sense of humor. In his final hours, he went down in history for apologizing for being such a time dying, a poignant expression of his regard for others, even at the cost of great suffering. The king's ultimate demise, however, was much more than a private tragedy. It was a political earthquake. The abruptness of his downfall, combined with unusual symptoms and vicious medical attempts, gave rise to instant rumor-mongering. For some, this was not a medical enigma, it was an assassination possibility. In an England already seething with religious intolerance, rumors of poisoning fueled widespread panic. Charles's own brother, James, was next in line to the throne, but he was avowedly Catholic in a zealous Protestant nation. That alone had precipitated waves of political turmoil in Charles's reign, culminating in the notorious exclusion crisis of the late 1670s, when Parliament tried to exclude James from inheriting the throne. So when Charles unexpectedly died, suspicion flared. Had Catholic plotters poisoned the Protestant king to make way for James? Many thought so. Charles had been in fairly good health just days before, after all. His illness came on with incredible speed, and theories ran wild. Some said Jesuit priests had added poison to his wine during private conferences. Others said Catholic physicians had given him poisonous medicines masquerading as remedies. These anxieties weren't bred in a vacuum. The larger political environment of the 1680s was already paranoia-scarred. Protestant England nervously observed Catholic nations such as France gaining strength. The false popish plot of 1678 had already shown how quickly anti-Catholic feeling could spiral out of control. The king's death, mysterious and spectacular, added fuel to an already burning fire. Even the autopsy, meant to shed light, only served to increase the mystery. The internal trauma to Charles's organs appeared horrifically extreme, too drastic, some claimed, to be natural. And with royal doctors unable to come to a definitive conclusion regarding the cause of death, speculation only grew louder. Then James's coronation. His rapid promotion of Catholic allies and his reorganization of the government came at exactly the right time to capitalize on Protestant fears. To many, it seemed that all of the things the conspiracy theorists had predicted were finally unfolding. When James was finally overthrown in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, some cited Charles's mysterious death as the beginning of a Catholic conspiracy to destroy English Protestantism. The repercussions did not stop at England. In Europe, leaders followed closely as the power of the religious dynamic shifted. Catholic France viewed a chance to win an important ally, with Protestant states such as Holland and portions of Germany becoming ever more apprehensive. A religious shift in England could reshape alliances and tip the balance in centuries-long continental wars. Historians today are quite sure about the medical fact. Charles II probably died of kidney failure, complicated by mercury poisoning and the ill-advised ministrations of his doctors. But during the 17th century, fact and rumor tended to go hand in hand, and suspicion about his death left a wound on English politics for decades. These suspicions directly influenced modern British monarchy. The dread of Catholic domination became a characteristic political force and gave rise to the firm establishment of Protestant succession. Never again would there be a Catholic sitting easy upon the English throne. Charles's death also reformed the practice of medicine for the royal family. Future monarchs would be treated more carefully, and there was increasingly skepticism towards barbaric treatments. The nasty tactics employed on Charles became a symbol for the perilous ignorance of pre-modern medicine, where science was replaced by superstition, and where even kings weren't immune. Over 3 centuries on, the life of Charles II remains fascinating to historians, medical professionals, and the general public. His case is not a sad footnote, more a sharp lens by which we see the shadowy side of scientific discovery, political suspicion, and royal authority. Modern science has solved the medical enigma. Charles's own experiments most probably resulted in chronic mercury exposure that gradually damaged his kidneys. His love of alchemy and early chemistry, admirable though it might have been, ultimately put paid to him. It was not like a dramatic one-time poisoning, but death by buildup. A subtle, unseen enemy seeping in with every breath he breathed in his lab. He wasn't alone. Many of the early chemists unwittingly met the same end, working in poorly ventilated rooms with no idea of the poisons they were working with. The demise of Charles II is a cautionary warning, not only against poisonous metals and medical blunders, but against the dangers of blind faith in imperfect systems, whether scientific or political, to bring even the mighty straight to destruction. The gruesome medical ordeal King Charles II suffered in his last days has since become a haunting reminder of the violence of pre-modern medicine. Blistering, bloodletting, and the giving of poisonous mixtures were performed with unshakable faith by some of the most trusted physicians in the kingdom, men who truly believed that they were preserving their king. To our 21st century eyes, these treatments look not much more than ritualized cruelty. But to the people in those times, they were the state of the art of medical science, informed not by empirical data, but by centuries of superstition and bad theory. The effects of Charles's demise resonated far outside the royal bedroom. The suspicion that he had been poisoned, politicized and religiously polarized, began to take root in English consciousness. Anxiety about Catholic conspiracies became a perpetual strand in English political life, sustaining in paranoia that would inform national policy for centuries. Some extreme historians still maintain even today that Charles was assassinated, as opposed to being aided by immense evidence to the contrary. Yet, the king's autopsy remains one of the most detailed medical records of the 17th century. It offers a rare and sobering glimpse into the health challenges faced by the aristocracy. Those who indulged in rich diets, heavy alcohol use, and dangerous exotic substances. Charles's case was likely not an anomaly, but a reflection of the hidden suffering of the elite class. His tale also discloses the isolation and vulnerability of absolute monarchs, surrounded by courtiers, physicians, and advisors whose motives were not always disinterested. In Charles's case, this solitude proved fatal. Where an everyday fellow might have been left to die quietly, the king was subjected to every remedial experiment, no matter how effective or cruel. Sadly, Charles passed away only a few decades before the genuine scientific revolution in medicine commenced to make its pace. Greater knowledge of human anatomy, organ function, and toxicology would ultimately follow, but too late for the merry monarch. His death is a dark lesson. Even the strongest among us are not safe from ignorance's consequences. Charles's gradual decline, fueled by decades of mercury exposure and compounded by savage medical treatment, remains one of history's most lucid illustrations of how good intentions, scientific innocence, and political timidity can combine to create a deadly mixture. What makes his death particularly sad is not only its brutality, but its avoidability. Had only the risks of mercury been understood. Had only the doctors comprehended the physiology of the kidneys. Had only the political atmosphere not been so dominated by religious hysteria. Any one of these variables might have altered his destiny. Rather, Charles fell victim to his own scientific inquisitiveness, his doctors' misplaced overconfidence, and the tempestuous politics of the era. The state of his body. His head swelling with water, his organs collapsing, his blood vessels engorged, spoke in silence of a man who had been dying for decades while still projecting the image of kingly vigor. His dignified suffering only heightens the tragedy. To realize that the very men charged with saving him probably brought about his demise, not out of ill will, but out of sincere ignorance, is perhaps the most agonizing irony of all. The theories of conspiracy that followed his death show how fast uncertainty and mystery can turn into mass fear and social unrest. Without scientific explanation, individuals resorted to political discourse, and those discourses would be used to fuel the revolution that redefined the British monarchy for all time. In the end, the reality was stranger and more tragic than any of the conspiracies. Charles II had poisoned himself gradually, by years of unprotected exposure to mercury in his all-consuming experiments. His tale is a sobering reminder that scientific progress always comes at great expense. Much of the key lessons of modern medicine are not set down in texts, but in tragedy. Charles's death was the cost of royal naivety in a time when curiosity could be as lethal as a sword, and well-meaning intentions could prove deadly. The actual horror, however, was not what they discovered within his body, but what it indicated: that kings are no more immune to forces beyond their comprehension, and that blind faith in defective systems, medical, scientific, or political, can leave even the most powerful men broken, vulnerable, and alone. With the passing of Charles II, not only had a reign come to an end, but with it, an era of medical innocence had passed away, nevermore.